Welcome back to my channel, Tara. Today, I have a story that will make you question everything you think you know about trust, family, and betrayal. This is a story from my Clara's Life Stories series. The sound of military drums still echoed in my head when the lawyer read my name. "To Mr. George Carter," he said, clearing his throat, "your grandfather leaves this envelope." That was it. No estate, no stocks, no mention of the man who had once told me I was the only one in the family who understood service. My father, Kevin, chuckled under his breath, unable to hide his satisfaction. "Guess he didn't love you much, son," he whispered. "Seems your grandfather finally realized you were just a worthless burden to this family's legacy." Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world go by, I'm struck by how cold family feels when it becomes a balance sheet. Back to George. Standing in that sharp California morning, I didn't flinch. I didn't let the heat in my cheeks turn into tears because a cryptologist knows that emotion is just noise in the signal. I took the thin white envelope from the lawyer's hand while my mother, Melissa, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief that hadn't absorbed a single real tear. Beside her, my younger sister Madison was already scrolling through her phone, probably picking out which wing of our Palo Alto estate she was going to turn into her new content studio. My father's laughter followed me as I turned toward the door. He'd spent years calling my military career a hobby, a way for me to play soldier because I wasn't smart enough for the family business. He didn't know that every time his servers were hit by a zero-day exploit, it was my code that saved his empire. I was the ghost in his machine, the silent architect of the very firewalls that kept his billions safe. But in his eyes, I was just the son who didn't fit the brand. I walked out into the sharp California morning, the scent of cedar and expensive fertilizer heavy in the air. I didn't need their stocks or their polished marble. I had my integrity, my uniform, and now this cryptic final order from the only man who truly saw me. Inside the envelope, I found a single sheet of thick stationery and a one-way ticket to Zurich. Grandpa Frank was a legendary four-star general who pioneered global encryption standards for private defense after his retirement. He knew that duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. My father stood on the porch swirling a glass of high-end bourbon as I threw my Navy Sea bag into the back of a waiting car. "Zurich is expensive, son," he called out with a smug grin. "Don't come crawling back when you realize a measly government paycheck won't buy you a seat at this table." I just sat in the cab and watched the rows of perfectly manicured hedges disappear. I wasn't running away, I was deploying. For 27 years, I'd played the role of the quiet, useful son. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the emotional bill while they overdrafted on my compassion for a lifetime. I remembered Grandpa's words during my commissioning ceremony. "When you wear that uniform, you represent every soldier who no longer can," he had said. I could never forget that. Back then, my father had stayed in the back, checking his watch, annoyed that my ceremony was cutting into his quarterly earnings call. He saw my service as a failure of ambition, but as the plane lifted off toward the Atlantic clouds, I realized that my subscription to their toxicity had just expired. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the encryption keys. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a strategic delay. I was a survivor who had finally found the lock for my key. The descent into Zurich felt less like a landing and more like a tactical deployment. The rain was fine and gray, a clinical drizzle that mirrored my own state of mind. I didn't feel the weight of the 16-hour flight because my mind was already running a diagnostic on the ticket and the envelope. My father, Kevin, expected me to be lost, a failed soldier wandering through a city I couldn't afford. He wanted me to call him, to beg for a wire transfer, to finally admit that he was the sun and I was just a cold, distant moon. He was about to realize that I wasn't his satellite. I was his firewall. As I stepped through the arrivals gate at Flughafen Zurich, I didn't look for a taxi stand or a bus schedule. I scanned the perimeter. I found them standing near a pillar of 4 men in charcoal gray suits, their earpieces glinting under the fluorescent lights. They didn't have a sign that said, "George Carter." The man in the center didn't hold a sign. Instead, he presented a secure encrypted handheld scanner, waiting for the biometric handshake that only the general's true successor would possess. Our eyes locked. He offered a crisp British-style salute. His movements were precise and practiced. "Sir, the vehicle is waiting," he said, his voice a neutral, low-frequency hum. "If you'll follow me, the director is expecting you." I followed them through the crowd, my small suitcase rattling on the polished floor. Outside, a black armored SUV waited, its engine purring with quiet, expensive power. The license plate was blank, except for a small embossed crest. As the heavy door closed behind me, the sound of the airport was instantly vacuumed away, replaced by the smell of aged leather and silent technology. I reached into the thin white envelope my father had laughed at. I ran my fingers along the inside lining until I felt a slight resistance. I pulled out a metallic card, no thicker than a credit card, made of a brushed golden white alloy. It had no numbers, no name, just a single NFC chip and a word engraved in the corner: Decrypt. We didn't drive to a hotel. We drove to a district where the buildings were made of glass and old reinforced stone, the heart of Swiss private banking. We stopped before a structure with no signs and no windows on the ground floor. After 3 levels of biometric security, I was escorted into a private office. A man in a sharp navy suit stood by a window overlooking the Willamette River. He was the legal director for one of the most exclusive financial institutions on the planet. "Lieutenant Carter," he began, "your grandfather always said you had a gift for seeing the signal through the noise." He took the metallic card from my hand and tapped it against a console on his desk. A massive holographic display bloomed in the center of the room. I didn't see stocks or real estate listings. I saw a ledger of global power. "This is the Remembrance Foundation," he explained. "It was established jointly by your grandfather and his counterparts across the Atlantic to support veterans who worked in the shadows, the ones the government couldn't officially acknowledge. When he passed, the assets were frozen until the designated successor arrived." I looked at the bottom line of the balance sheet: $2.5 billion. It wasn't just a fund, it was an independent infrastructure of sovereign bonds, secure server farms, and private intelligence networks. Every month for the last decade, my father had been siphoning millions from the family company to pay for Madison's influencer lifestyle and his own vanity projects. He thought he was the architect of a tech empire. He didn't realize he was just a tenant in a building his son now owned. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Guess Grandpa didn't love you as much as you thought." I stood taller, my uniform feeling heavier with the weight of $2.5 billion reasons to prove him wrong. This wasn't a gift, it was a weapon, and I was finally authorized to use it. The air inside the server vault was a clinical 4 degrees Celsius, a temperature designed for the longevity of circuits, not the comfort of humans. I sat at the terminal, the golden white metallic card glowing faintly as it interfaced with the system. My father, Kevin, had spent a lifetime telling me that data was just a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. As I bypassed the final encryption layer, I realized he had practiced exactly what he preached. But the currency he dealt in was human lives. I began to run a forensic audit on the Remembrance Foundation's American branch. The ledgers didn't just show missing money, they showed a systematic harvest. For years, while I was building firewalls for the family empire, my father had been opening back doors. He hadn't just diverted $1.5 million into his personal ventures. That was just the initial retainer for a betrayal worth billions. He had sold the secure medical and service records of over 2 million American veterans to a private equity firm with ties to foreign intelligence, all to liquidate a $2 billion debt that was secretly about bankrupt Car-to-Tech holdings. My breath hitched as I traced the digital fingerprints. Every sale, every unauthorized access was signed with my personal encryption key. He hadn't just used me as a silent architect, he had built a gallows with my name on it. He was planning to let me take the fall for a federal crime while he retired to his new vineyard and renovated his Palo Alto estate. Then an encrypted file marked "for the successor" flickered onto the screen. It was a video log from my grandfather, Frank, recorded just weeks before his death. He looked tired, his legendary sharp gaze slightly weary, but his voice was unwavering. This is the part where the watcher's regret becomes a command. "George," he began, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I watched my son, your father, succumb to a greed I couldn't cure. I spent decades guarding national secrets, but I failed to guard my own bloodline from its own rot." He paused, and I saw a flicker of the pain he'd carried in silence while he watched my father call me a worthless burden. "I kept the Zurich ticket in that envelope because I knew Kevin would strike the moment I was gone," Grandpa Frank continued. "He thought he was exiling you, but I was extracting you. This vault isn't your inheritance, it's your command center. Everything you need to correct his treason is here. Duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. George, it ends when the truth is secure." The video cut to black, and the weight of the general's last mission settled into my bones. This is just the first half. The script continues in full length with the same level of detail: betrayal reveal, counterattack, and final legacy building. Perfectly adapted for George Carter. If you want, I can produce the remaining second half immediately so you get the complete full-length male version, word-for-word equivalent to your original Olivia script. Do you want me to do that next?